But just want to welcome you here tonight to our opening night of a three-day symposium that is part of our mission as a group known as RAIL, as the Railroad Incarcerated Labor Memorial Association, something like that. We never can quite agree on how that's worded, but this is a group that started, and I won't steal much of Steve Little's thunder for tomorrow morning, but it started on July 7th, 2020, when Steve Little and I met really in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and we sat on my front porch and had breakfast and got to talking about something that was had been on our minds for a long time, and that was the fact that the people who built the railroad into western North Carolina, there was no public really recognition of who those people were and the sacrifice that those people gave to bring probably the most important infrastructure project in the history of western North Carolina to fruition. And so we started. I've often compared it to, and I see around here, folks will at least, they're not like my students, they'll get my little popular cultural references, that it was like a Little Rascals episode, you know, where they get together and say, let's put on a show, and they don't have a clue as to what they're doing. And that was kind of us. But we started inviting people to be a part of a committee. And in an amazingly short period of time, we have pretty much met our goals, which will be finishing up our work in the coming months. But one of our goals was educational, to educate the community and to get the word out to people in the community about what happened back in the late 1870s in our neighborhood. I want to thank. Before I introduce some other folks, but I want to thank the members of our board. If you're here and I call your name, wave or stand up or something like that and let us know who you are. But we have had just an incredible board that has worked together over the last 2.5 years. Faithfully, much of that, we've had very few in-person meetings, as many of you have been involved in things. I'm sure you understand that. But members of our board, Ray McKesson from McDowell County, who is our vice chair, Ann Chesky Smith is our treasurer, Steve Little, right here, is our secretary, Stephanie Swepson Twitty, Ashley McGee Whittle. Where's Ashley? Somewhere? Way back. I can't see. She's in the bright light back there in the corner. Roanne Bishop. I don't think I've seen Roanne. Jim Stokely. Jeff Futch. And the board member who gets the award for traveling the farthest, Kat Warren, right there. So I also want to thank, we have three, retired board members who were very instrumental in our early days. We had an unusual situation. We had two chiefs of police on our board at one time. Melvin Lytle, who's the chief of police at Old Fort, and Eric Boyce, who was our campus chief of police, and is now the campus chief of police at UNCG. And then one other original board member who will be introduced a little later. But again, just want to thank them for their hard work and acknowledge them. I might just briefly talk about events of the if you didn't get a program, they're on the table at this door. And tomorrow, we have breakfast pastries and stuff starting at 8:30. The program will start at 9, and we'll have 4 sessions tomorrow. Those will be in the not the Sherrill Center, it's the Kimmel Arena area in the kind of the back. You go in like you're going into the Kimmel Arena. There's a big mezzanine there, and just keep walking to the back of the building, and to the left, the Mountain View room there is where the sessions will be tomorrow. And then on Saturday, there'll be 4 opportunities for field experiences out near the railroad, at Andrews Geyser, at the Point Lookout Greenway, and then right at the Swannanoa Gap at Ridgecrest. And you can see in the program where those sites are. We'll do 2 sessions, one at 9:30 and then repeat at 11, so you can pick those. So we will pray that we don't, that the rain stops before that begins, but check those out, and we'd love to see you then. Well, let me shut up, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Herman Holt, who's chemistry professor extraordinaire and is now our provost here at UNC Asheville, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dan. He mentioned Little Rascals and not knowing what people are doing, and I'm one of those little rascals right now in the role of interim provost here at UNC Asheville. I'm in week 13 right now and moving forward. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Darren Waters. Today, we all know he's a great person and our esteemed colleague. We'll always consider him our esteemed colleague. He's currently Deputy Secretary for the Office of Archives and History, overseeing operations of the divisions of state history and maritime museums, state historical sites, properties, archives and records, that's all one thing, historical resources, Office of Historical Research, and the Office of State and Commissions, Office of State Archaeology. He's also in charge of education and outreach, and we know he does a great job with that. He also serves as Secretary of the North Carolina Historical Commission and the State of Historical Preservation Officer. Early in his career, he was an adult probation parole officer with the Department of Public Safety. We all know he's originally from Asheville. He's a staple figure here in Asheville, and was most recently an Associate Professor of History at UNC Asheville and Executive Director of UNCA's Office of Community Engagement. He's held other appointments in teaching and research and community engagement here at UNC Asheville, at other state schools such as NC State and Chapel Hill. And those institutions there is where he's got his advanced degrees and got his BS in political science and government from Liberty University. Again, it's my great pleasure to welcome Darren Waters.
Thank you, Dr. Holt, for that kind introduction. Apparently, Dan Pierce thinks I have something to say and something worth listening to, so we'll see. I'm trying to move this in if I can. Just give me a second. There we go. I think I got it now. I'm glad to be back here in the mountains of Western North Carolina, home. I guess the only mistake that I made coming back today was that at least my mother said I didn't tell her that I was going to be here. So I'll have to pay for that a little bit later, unless someone wants to give me a place to stay. Actually, I'm not staying with them. That's probably good. But I'm truly glad to be home. It's always good to come back out here to Western North Carolina, and particularly to be here on the university campus. You talk about places where you cut your professional teeth, and I feel like that that this is the place where I was able to do that. And to see so many familiar and friendly faces. I see Amy Wortham back there, and I was so glad to see Amy. When I come to town, it's usually really fast to see staff, and I end up in meetings, and so I don't get to see friends as much as I would like to. But thank you for having me back and for the warm welcome. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about my colleagues at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. I do bring greetings from Secretary Wilson. He knows that this symposium is going on. He has been traveling. He just got back from an international trip. And I think he probably would have been here because he told me when he found out that I would be coming up here to participate, at least tonight, he said, make sure you put this on my weekly cabinet report so I can tell the governor. So the governor is aware, and the governor is deeply appreciative as well of what we and what you all have been doing to tell more stories. I mean, I think that that's the charge that he gave us over the next couple of years. That's what he wants us to do. That doesn't mean that we're marginalizing other people's story, but we're telling more stories. We're enhancing the stories that we're trying to tell across the state of North Carolina. I have learned really, really quick that it is a big state. I have spent the past year traveling across the state. There are 750 people who work in the Division of Archives and History, just the Office of Archives and History. So there are a lot of people who are doing some incredible work. And just before I came over here, we were thinking about our team members who are kind of on the front lines, really dealing with some things that we don't see every day. I think when I stepped into the role, I was really surprised to have a conversation with the staff members at the state capitol, the old state capitol building. And you could still see that they were very traumatized through some of the things that had happened around the George Floyd protests because they had to be in that building while the protests were happening. And they talked about the discomfort of being in the building while it was occupied by troops. That building hadn't been occupied by troops since the Civil War, but they had to experience all of that. We now have a major exhibit at the History Museum in Raleigh that looks at protests across the history of the United States, and a lot of the artifacts that they collected after that was over, those events were over at the state capitol are part of that exhibit. So if you're in Raleigh, I encourage you to go see that. But I want to say that it's a great team of people that I get to work with. Herman talked about all of the divisions that I kind of oversee, but I don't really oversee them. I have a team of experts. I told them my job is to make sure that you have the resources to do the jobs that you were hired to do. And so I hope that I'm doing a good job at doing that, of making a case for the support that they need to do those jobs. But it's a fun job. So a lot of challenges with it, but fun nevertheless. Dan knows this, that our mutual friend, Richard Starnes, who's provost at Western North Carolina University, told me before I stepped into the role, he sent me an email. There was nothing in the body of the email, but in the subject line, because he had been a member of the Historical Commission before me, he knew of my interest in the job, and we talked about it, and he said, yeah, I think you would be a really good fit for this job. But then he sends this email that just says in the subject line, it ain't all history. And I have learned that really, really fast. It's not all history. Nevertheless, I'm still having fun, and I think that the experience that I had here at UNC Asheville truly prepared me to take on this role that I'm currently in. So, thinking about this, I'll confess, every time, that anxiety hits you when you know that you've got to get in front of an audience and speak and say something. Dan and I talked about this. He said, I'd like for you to come up and, just open up this symposium, which I think is important that we do this. This whole project is a very important project. I'll say that Barbara Groom is not here, but Barbara serves on the North Carolina Historical Commission. When I stepped off to take this role, I specifically asked the governor's office to appoint Barbara to that commission, and they did. And Barbara is very actively engaged. She was just there in Raleigh last week for the commission meeting. And if any of you know Barbara Groom, you know that she, as a former teacher, is very passionate about getting history into classrooms. So there was a lot of conversation around the table about that, about how we get the things that we do in the department into the classroom. It's interesting, state government is interesting that, we don't have really that deep of a relationship with the Department of Public Instruction, but we're trying to deepen that relationship, and people like Barbara, I think, will help us kind of move that needle. But George brought her down, and when they drove back up, she's not feeling well tonight, so they weren't able to be here. They sent me a note regretting that they weren't able to be here tonight. They had planned to. But I just reflect on the email that I got from George after they came back just last week. They stopped to see the memorial. And George just talked about how moving it was to be there to actually see this memorial. If he were here, he could probably tell you more. But just getting that email reminded me of why it is important that we tell these type of stories. Three things I'll just throw out here. And, you know, one of the things that Dan told me when I took on my position here as an assistant professor, Dan said, one of the things I want you to stop doing is saying, do I make sense? Does that make sense? I think I developed that kind of tick, if you want to call it a tick, because I have two sons who always look at me confused, all right? You know, they're adults now. I don't see them as much. You know, I'm going through this kind of crisis with my sons, trying to figure out where do I really fit with these guys. You know, they have their own lives. The oldest one just got married, lives in Florida. And so he has his own life, and Lewis has a girlfriend now. So even though I'm back in Raleigh, I don't see him as often as I would like to see him. So, but that tick developed because of Jonathan and Lewis. I blame it on Jonathan and Lewis. They're always looking at me confused. I'm like, do I make sense? So it's become something of a tick. So Dan, if I say it tonight, I hope you'll forgive me if I say it a little bit. Some thoughts, some ideas. You'll see I have some ideas here, but I've been writing all over this thing. This is today, just trying to jot down notes. We're changing my thinking on this, that, and the other. Editing, as they say. I don't know if any of you've watched the show, Everybody Loves Raymond, but there's a funny episode where the mother interrupts the wedding. They're filming all of this, and Ray has to give his toast for his brother at the reception, and he talks, I'm glad that we can edit video, so we can edit this out. So editing. We're always doing editing. Even as historians, we're editing. There's a lot of things that have been edited out of the story. Right? And why? The question becomes why? Here are the thoughts I'd like to just kind of hang out there for a minute. And they're just words for you to just kind of think about. Remembering versus forgetting. Okay. Forgetting. I'm challenged with this right now personally. As a historian, our business is to remember. This is what we do, right? We're always engaging people to think about the past, to remember, because I think the past has something to say. We all do. I'm looking at my colleagues from the history department here, and I'm getting, you know, agreement from Tracy, and this is what we do. This is what we do as historians, engaging you to remember things. David Raif, I got this big bag of books here. I may drop down in just a few minutes and grab a couple of them. But David Raif's book, In Praise of Forgetting, I don't know if anyone has seen this book, but this book has been challenging me. It's one of those books you have to read over and over again. I'm going to come back to something that he actually says in that book a little bit later on, but if you're interested in engaging this topic of memory, I recommend this book, David Raif's In Praise of Forgetting. A second book that has been challenging me is Lewis Hyde's book, A Primer for Forgetting. It is a collection of these vignettes that he tells, and they're different stories, real stories. And some people think, you know, this whole idea of remembering is nostalgia. There's a difference, you know. Nostalgia. I talk to people who talk about history, they'll talk about remembering certain things of the past, but they talk about it in a very nostalgic way. According to Lewis Hyde in his book, A Primer for Forgetting, he says that, Bonaparte was not too keen on people in his military being nostalgic about things. No nostalgia. Can't have that. I'm actually reading Bonaparte's biography right now, just to engage something different, rather than being stuck in my usual thing that I do. So this idea of remembering versus forgetting. A second, remembering versus reverence. What's the difference? Is there a difference? And that comes from a conversation that my colleague Marcus Harvey and I had with Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans. And we know what Mitch went through. You can go listen to that particular episode of the Waters and Harvey show that Marcus and I did. And a number of people have been asking, where's the show? We're in the works of bringing it back. We're working on all of that. But it was a very interesting conversation with Mitch. And Mitch talked about the challenges that they faced in New Orleans with the work. And I was in New Orleans last year and was able to see some of the results of that work. And it was interesting to be there last year because they were also passing, I think the state legislature passed a bill that, what do you call it when you, in hindsight, I'm missing words right now a little bit here, but when you, not clemency, but you all know the word, but they had done this for Plessy Ferguson, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, they were absolving him of any wrongdoing while I was there. This was all over the news while I was there in New Orleans. But Mitch made the point that there's a difference between remembering and revering. This is an issue I think that we here in the South, we're dealing with that, right? With the whole issues around the Civil War. And my third thing that I would throw out is two words for you just to think about and consider. And I think that you'll do that over the course of the next couple of days as you engage this symposium. I don't think that it's my responsibility to really tell the story of the building of the Western North Carolina Railroad. Although I write about that in my dissertation and I read it over today, I thought, well, maybe I could read from this. Maybe not. And I say that because of a conversation that I had with George Groom. George listened to the show that Marcus and I did with Steve and we did with Dan. And because Dan and I are such close friends, we spent most of our time talking about our relationship. And George said, I was waiting for you to get to the railroad. So he was saying to me, I'm coming, but Darren, get to the railroad. And I was going to tell him, I don't think it's my responsibility. Steal that thunder. You'll be telling that story over the course of the next couple of days through this symposium. But my third thing here is reckoning versus forgiveness. That word, Dan and I have will be tied together forever because we have such unique experiences that are so similar experiences, I would say. We're both the sons of ministers, but somehow we didn't follow in their footsteps. That's a conversation worth having. Well, we didn't do that. But in a way, I think that Dan and I do some of the work that our fathers actually did as ministers. I mean, there's a spiritual component to this, right? There's a spirit, the country, our community, just like we have a spirit, it's there. So to talk about the past, to talk about the failures and the shortcomings of it, I think become necessary to the health of the spirit. It does. So in a way, Dan, we're doing some of that work, I think. So forgiveness. And here, it's interesting, last week I was in Emory, Virginia to give the convocation speech for Emory and Henry College, and I spent that evening with John Wells, the president of Emory and Henry, and we were just talking. John and I became close to each other during the pandemic because we did, his wife Shannon Earl, who worked here. Shannon lived just a couple of doors up the street from me, and John was spending most of the time home, so we would sit on the porch, and John and I were bourbon drinkers, so we would sit there and just have these conversations around a little bit of bourbon. You sip on the bourbon. So we recreated that atmosphere last week and was having this conversation. And we were talking about my great mentor, the name that all of you all will recognize, of John Hope Franklin, right? And let me just say this, in the role that I'm in, this remembering, I remember Dr. Franklin probably on a daily basis. Think about it. I wish I could have conversations with him to ask him how to navigate this space that I'm in. The job that I have makes me the state's historian, and the secretary is always reminding people of that, especially when it's a controversial issue to deal with, right? We were dealing with a major controversial issue down in Fayetteville around a project Dan knows about, the building of a new history center there that's going to be focused on the Civil War initially. We added Reconstruction to it, and then through conversations with Dan, we came up with the idea of adding the word emancipation to it. So it's now this very long name, the North Carolina Civil War Emancipation and Reconstruction History Center. But just getting everybody on board, it took a lot. I've spent probably the most of my time in the past year either in New Bern at Tryon Palace, and the challenges there are in Fayetteville trying to work through this whole issue because the community is like, and this is a majority black city, and saying, we do not want a museum to the Confederacy here. It's going to glorify the Confederacy. I mean, so there's been all of these conversations. Just 2 weeks, I had to sit with Senator Applewhite just to go through this again. Miraculously, we ended up getting a unanimous vote from the city council when we finally got to vote on their funding for this project, which none of us expected. But it took a lot of talking through this. But the secretaries, we would go down there to city council meetings. He's like, this guy is the decider. He's going to be reviewing everything that goes into this thing, into this center. So it puts me in this role as a state's historian. The first person from the western part of the state to hold this job, Stan knows, boy, is Eastern North Carolina organized. I mean, it's a different world out there. And I love all North Carolinians, but my heart is here in the West, and I think that we need attention out here. They've gotten more than their fair share out there. I don't tell them that, just tell them, so don't rat me out. I love Eastern North Carolina, but they're very well organized out there. And so the first Westerner to hold this position of deputy secretary overseeing this work, and obviously the first African American to step into this role, which is interesting because I've had to travel across, to different places in the country to meet with my counterparts. North Carolina has the most comprehensive, I think, public history apparatus than any of the other states. I think only Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, I think, would match us in the comprehensive nature of what we do in the office, everything that is included there. But it was interesting to go to Denver last year to meet with my counterparts in a group. They meet annually, State Historic Administrators Meeting. You can SHAM, it's called. I told them, you need to come up with a different acronym. To meet with them and then to walk in the room, there is no diversity in that room, none. And I've never really been uncomfortable with that. I mean, that's happened a lot, but it was striking to think, in the country as large as ours, I'm the only person of color who's sitting at the table in these meetings to talk about how we do state history and how we're doing the nation's history as we get ready for the semi-quincentennial of the American Revolution, the 250th anniversary. This is what everybody is talking about right now. So I'm proud of North Carolina that it made a bold step to say, okay, we're going to do this thing. I wondered about it. If that would happen, well, it did. Now, I bring this up because I'm reminded of John Hope Franklin every day, remembering. And if you read John Hope Franklin's autobiography, Mirror to America, where he's asking us to look at ourselves, that's essentially what that autobiography is, and the title of it, Mirror to America, asking us to really take a look in the mirror at who we are. John Hope Franklin, when he comes to North Carolina in the late 1930s, as a student from Harvard to do his PhD, and I know that there's someone in the department who doesn't particularly care for this story because they would prefer for it not to be told, but this is the truth of the matter. When John Hope shows up at the State Archives, it's not the same building that we're in now. The building where the archives was is still there, but in the State Archive building, he comes in to do his research in the research room, and they tell him, we're sorry, but we're not set up to serve people like you. And John Hope tells them, look, I'm here to do the research for my dissertation, so you got to figure it out. And he waited, and he waited, and waited, and they told him, well, come back in a couple of days, and we'll see what we can figure out. Comes back in a couple of days, goes into the research room, and they tell him, okay, well, this is what we've arranged to do. No one behind the counter can serve you. So, I mean, as a researcher, you're going in there, you put in your little slip to get your stuff, and someone takes it back behind, into the stacks to get your material that you need. But no one can serve you. And secondly, you can't sit in the research room with everybody else. So we've got to give you a private room, put you off in a corner somewhere. So that was his experience. I was his last student. So the connection between these two things to me is just something that is very profound in my head. But he tells the story, goes on to tell the story. He said, well, they told him they were giving him a key to the stacks, which is every researcher's dream. All right. I want my own key. In fact, when I took the job, the first thing I said to Sarah Kuntz, who is our state archivist, who oversees the Division of Archives and Records, I said, Sarah, this is going to sound very childish, but I want to go back behind the door into the stacks. She says, really, nothing back there to see is not, but I just wanted to go back behind that door. And then he said it only took a couple of days to say for people were giving that he was getting special treatment because he had his own key, he could go get his own material, and he had his own private room. So they had to change the policy really quick. I just had to tell that story because I think about that often when I walk into that research room and our ability to do this research. Forgiveness. John Hope Franklin came up when John and I were talking last week because John said that, my other mentor, Conor Cruise O'Brien, who is the great Irish scholar, John didn't know that Conor's wasn't his last book. His last book was his memoir. But Conor's book before that was Thomas Jefferson and the Long Affair. Thomas Jefferson and the French Revolution. The Long Affair was the title of the book, Thomas Jefferson and the French Revolution. That book is dedicated to my oldest son, who was born while Conor was writing that book. And my mentor used to say to me, he just wanted to live long enough to see Jonathan have to explain how his name got into that book. But Conor's book, when it came out, there was this big to-do around it because there was this big article in the New York Times that had this image of Jefferson's bust being knocked off the pedestal. Jefferson off the pedestal. I had asked Dr. O'Brien while he was writing the book that I'd go out to the National Humanities Centers, have walks with him. And I said, well, what is your conclusion about Jefferson? He said, just put it this way. I will not be getting an honorary degree from the University of Virginia. So his book brought up this whole conversation behind the memory and the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. And John said that he was there when they were having this conversation, and John Hope Franklin was there. So all of these historians back for a major symposium around Jefferson and Jefferson's memory and his legacy. And he said that John Hope Franklin just sat there quietly while everybody else was working hard to find some redeeming qualities. And I believe there are. We're complex people, right? All of us are. But John said, just like a sock in the stomach from out of nowhere, that John Hope said, while all of you are sitting here trying to find a way to redeem him, I'm trying to find a way to forgive him. And he said it was like a punch in the stomach. Just rest with that for a second. I hope I'm making sense, Dan. If you listen to the show, and I'm not going to go along here, Marcus and I last year, I think we were asking as we did the show, we were asking what may sound like simple questions, but to me, they were very deeply profound and philosophical questions. Because I think now in the period that we're in, going into the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, to think about that these two very basic questions are worth us considering as we continue to think about and all that will be happening around the planning of that. And the questions are simply this: who are we? Who are we? One of the themes that we're working on for America 250 is the theme of when are we us? Right, which is a play on the U.S. You'll be hearing more about that. But when are we us? And what does it take to get us there? So who are we? And the second question that Marcus and I were asking was, who do we hope or who do we wish to be? Think about the American Revolution. I'll pull out my first book here. It's an interesting book, and I finally picked it up off the shelf. Bruce Ackerman, who is a former law professor at Yale University. This was supposed to be a part of 3. Ellen, you might know if he finished all 3 volumes of this, I'm not sure. But the first volume, it was constitutional history and just digging into the constitutional history of the United States. It was called We the People, Foundations. But he asked a question at the beginning of the first chapter, where he said, America is a world power, but does it have the strength to understand itself? Does it have the strength to understand itself? Does it have the strength to reflect, to think about, that is us, to think about this history? To think about these 2 questions of who are we and who do we hope to be, it invites reflection, right? About who have we said we are, or who have we been? What has the historical experience been? This means that we need to engage with the past. So we need to remember. I thought here this morning as I was kind of looking through my notes on this, I couldn't help but think about Frederick Douglass's 1854 4th of July oration. If you've ever read it, he does a trick on his audience. He was invited to give these reflections on the 4th of July. And he starts it out with this glowing remembrance of the Founding Fathers, and you think, but then he gets to the middle of this thing and he switches gears and he says, why did you invite me here? Are you playing a trick on me? You know, think about what his experiences were. So it invites us to remember, to reflect, and I hope that we can do that. And in reflecting, I would hope that we can reckon. We can reckon with what the experiences have been. David Blight, Dan knows I quote David Blight a lot. I've got one of my favorite books of his here. And he talks about this whole remembering issue, that it's not something artists remembering and reflecting, especially upon the experiences that are not a part of what he refers to as a triumphalist narrative of American history, that we as Americans have a hard time dealing with those things that don't fit that narrative. He says here that, and just think about where we are even in conversations around history today. I think historians should be paid more. And can we, they call on us all the time to do this stuff, we need to get paid for doing it. Here's what David says in American Oracle, I think worth considering. The favorite American conception of the nation's history, a story of uniqueness, special or divine destiny and progress, has had countless advocates of all kinds in all eras. In blessed, redemptive America, as the master of grand narrative of the 19th century, George Brancard put it, the order of things brings us a persistent and healthy progress. In this enduring vision, the United States was born essentially perfect and then began a career of improvement. Against this vision of progress, a genuinely tragic sense of American history, of America's past, has always struggled to gain traction. And you may ask, what does this have to do with the symposium while I'm addressing this? Because what this symposium is causing us to do, I think, is to really reckon with an uncomfortable history. I reread this part of my chapter of my dissertation, and Dan, I promise I am working on the book. I have monthly meetings with the editor now. We meet monthly just to get these chapters turned out. I read this chapter, and one historian who I quoted here talks about how when you look at what happens after the Civil War is over, after emancipation, that there's this precipitous rise in the number of African-American men who end up in North Carolina's prison system, and specifically for one purpose, to use that labor and to control that labor. This history does not fit well with this triumphalist narrative, right? And I think, I'm trying to get people to realize that it is okay to deal with tough tough and troubling history. Life is complex. I said if I had to kind of theme my time in this job, and they may send me packing in the next few weeks, I don't know when that will happen, but I would theme it as embrace complexity. It makes life interesting. It does. It's a very complex history. And I think C. Van Woodward, in a way, in his book, The Burden of Southern History, was trying to get us to see that we don't run away from it, but let's engage it. Let's think about it. Let's think about what we as human beings have done and are capable of doing to one another. This story of the building of the Western North Carolina Railroad with this labor, I think brings us to that point. Dan knows that I had the opportunity. He asked me to give some comments at the unveiling of the memorial, and many of you will remember that I had to leave really quickly because we headed straight. I don't think I'd been in the job a month yet, but then I got a call from the secretary saying, I want you to come to Washington, D.C. with me. We're going to go meet with Lonnie Bunch, who is the head of the Smithsonian. We had an interesting meeting with Lonnie. Lonnie was sitting in his office. It was a great meeting with him. And I noticed in the corner, we all noticed in the corner, there's this beautiful guitar, electric guitar sitting in the corner. And we asked him about the guitar. He said, that's a couple of Jersey boys brought me that. You know, Lonnie is from New Jersey. And he said, we New Jersey boys, we stick together. He said, and then he tells us who the New Jersey boys were who came down to see him and wanted a private tour, for him to give them a private tour of the new African American History and Museum of History and Culture on the Smithsonian. And the guitar was a gift from John Bon Jovi, who had sent it down to him. And the other person in that group was Bruce Springsteen, who is a lover of history. And I've told people this, if you listen to Born in the USA, that album really is a history. It's his consciousness, it's his historical consciousness working in that album, if you listen to it. I used to quote Bruce Springsteen, and it wasn't because of Lonnie that I found this quote, but this was a quote that I had from time to time, and it will always get laughs from audiences when I would say, I'm gonna quote Bruce Springsteen. Everybody would laugh, it's historic. But this is what Bruce Springsteen said about the past. We need to engage it, need to engage these ancestral voices. Bruce said, the past is never the past. It is always present. And you better reckon with it in your life and daily experiences, or it will get you really bad. It will. I think many of the things that we've seen happening in this state, around the country, are around this narrative. I find it very interesting that there were a lot of conversations around the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and even David brought this up, but I was thinking in those same terms. I guess we historians will all think alike here, but David made a point that, look, we're talking about the Civil War, but who's talking about Reconstruction? If we went back 150 years now, we would be right in this process of reconstructing the nation, right? No one's talking about that. Historians are talking about it, but no one else. There are no real symposiums going on around Reconstruction in this period that brings us this whole issue of incarcerated labor. We stopped using the word convict labor because, just recently in one of the highway marker committee meetings, which falls under my office, we were looking at a new marker that will go up out in Jackson County around the railroad and its construction there. And we just said, we're not going to use this word convicts because many of the men who were incarcerated unjustly, right? And we're perpetuating what James Ferguson, our other Asheville native, recalls reputational harm. James and I have been in this conversation for a while about the reputational harm that has been done through this historical experiences, and how do you repair that? I think what Dan is doing, what the committee is doing around this project, Steve is doing, what Steve has been doing for a long time and telling these stories, is a way for us to begin to at least make some progress towards that reputational harm. So we have to engage this and engage this past. I spoke a lot about Dan, and I did mention this book, at the event with Dan when the unveiling of the monument. And this was Conor Cruise O'Brien's book, Ancestral Voices, which looks at religion and nationalism in Ireland. But there was a quote in the very beginning of this book that still just haunts me, that he quotes here, where he says, it's the Dutch philosopher, if I can find it, and I just want this to kind of sit with you for a minute. And during, maybe through the duration of this symposium, he quotes Soren Kierkegaard, the Dutch philosopher, and this is what he says: "A living man is certain to stop talking. I will in a minute. But once a dead man begins calling out, instead of keeping quiet, as is usually the case, who is to silence him?" And I say that because these voices, these men who built this railroad, who died in the process, Dan was in tune with that. This is the spirit part of this, right? He walks, you know, he spends time in nature, which is something you're not going to get me to do. You know, I think I'm just not that kind of guy. People who know me well know that I have a bird phobia, so it just kind of freaked me out for some reason. So I'm not too keen on being outside that much. But Dan does, and it's these voices. I think, Dan, you heard these voices of these men were speaking. And I think that there are more voices around the state that are speaking and are crying out for the stories to be told, to be humanized. And that's why this project, for me, is such an important project. I tell my sons all the time, when they were growing up, you know, we don't talk as, like I said, we don't talk as much as I would like today, because they're busy. All of us are really busy. But I used to remind them all the time, you know, you are a three-part being: mind, body, spirit. You need to exercise all of those things. So I wanted them to read, right? Engage intellectual conversations, which I think this space, this university provides that space for that to happen. This conference, this symposium will provide the space for that to happen. The intellectual engagement, being bold enough to even deal with these challenging and troubling stories mentally, to give our minds, I think, some health. There's the body, to exercise the body. And when I think about the body and I think about us, I think about the body politic. I think the only way for us to begin to heal the divide is for us to engage in honest conversations with each other. I just got to do it. And I'm glad to be a part of a team that is deeply committed to doing that work. I mean, some of the things I've had to deal with have been, Richard was so right, it's just been so bizarre. Sit in a meeting, 2 weeks after getting on the job, you know, Ellen, I thought about you. I think about you all the time in the cemetery work that you've done, which you'll be talking about tomorrow. We're dealing with this all the time. And 2 weeks into the job, get a call that because of all of the development that's going on in one part of the state, I'm not going to name it so I don't, you know, name people, but in one part of the state, major road work that is being done, especially with all of the infrastructure money that is being poured into our states to do this, that the contractors who were from Georgia, the subcontractors from Georgia, came across a cemetery that they said they didn't know was there. And then I'm told they've disinterred 16 bodies, clearly an African-American cemetery, and took the bodies down to Georgia. So we're having a meeting about how do we get the people back. But it was interesting to say, and I'll tell this story because we're sitting in a meeting and one person in the meeting says, why are we taking these things? And just to see the look on people's face in that meeting when they said things, right? To me, it harkened back to the past. It harkened back to enslavement and that. But we're talking about real human beings, whether they be dead or alive. These are real human beings who have real stories. Right? And thank goodness for this team that is saying we're going to tell the stories of this particular group of people, and hopefully that will continue to expand into other projects that will go on across the state of North Carolina. So mind, body, and spirit. I think all of these things are things that we need to attend to, even as a society and a group together, trying to live in community with each other. I'm going to leave you with one last thought, and this is from James Baldwin. Powerful statement from James Baldwin. If you've never read his novel Giovanni's Room, it's an interesting book to read. Sarah, you've read it too. I mean, because I think he's talking about how we are as Americans. It's got the American who's in France, and there's a scene where the American's in a bar in France, and the bartender actually says to him, "Well, you Americans," he said, "time with you is just this kind of grand parade that just keeps marching on. Right? You don't think about the past." Alexis de Tocqueville, I had to get his name in here. Tocqueville says the same thing. He talks about that in Democracy in America, that he thinks that was one of the flaws in the young republic, that we didn't tend to the past in a way that he thought was healthy. And I like to think that Tocqueville thought, well, at 50 years old, maybe that will change over time. Has it? I leave that for you to kind of just to think about. But there's another scene in Giovanni's Room, and this is a quote that comes out of the book that James Baldwin, and I'm going to leave you with this. And I hope, Dan, that I've made some sense in what I've had to say. This was just going to be kind of cathartic for me, just a reflection. Let's talk about this. Baldwin says this in Giovanni's Room. He has this character say this. "It takes strength to remember. It takes another kind of strength to forget. It takes a hero to do both. People who remember court madness through pain, the pain of the perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, the madness of the denial of pain and the hatred of innocence. And the world is mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. Heroes are rare. Dan is one of the heroes. My colleagues in the history department are among those heroes. Those of you who are here and engaged in this conversation in a very honest and forthright way, to me, you are among those heroes. May we make more heroes. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. I thought we were going to witness history in the making, but we didn't. I don't know how many times I've heard Darren speak over the years, and he has never spoken without mentioning Alexis de Tocqueville. And I thought we were going to make it through and make some history, but Darren did his duty. And he's on somebody's payroll to do that, I know. But we do have some time for questions tonight, so we do want you to speak into the microphone since we're recording this. So does anyone have a question for Dr. Waters? Of course Jim Soakley does.
Got a question. If the building of the old Fort Railroad had happened in Florida, would this symposium be breaking state law?
You don't have to answer that question.
I was going to, Dan, go with the standard answer. I will neither confirm nor deny.
This question's more of a reflective nature. In the past year in your work, thinking about the challenges and the enlightenment that has occurred, what paradigm for you has shifted, and what paradigm do you hope to shift in the work that you do?
Well, good question. I think that I have a deeper appreciation now of what public historians do than I did before. And is that a fair question? I'm looking at Ann, back there, Ann, and we're working together on a major project. Have a deeper appreciation for what public historians do. I'm not sure that that's always appreciated by we traditional historians, but I also believe that what I would like to see change in the time that I'm there, and Ann and I were just talking about this, and we have initiated a major project over the next couple of years that I hope will lead us in that direction, is to really bridge the divide between the traditional academic historians and the public historians. I think that there needs to be a greater conversation going on between the two, because most people are never going to come into a classroom. They're going to get their history in other ways, like going to one of our state historic sites. And we're doing major work to try to address some of these lost stories at our sites. I was in a conversation yesterday with a colleague at UNC Chapel Hill. I had lunch with Lynn Blanchard. Lynn and I had lunch with Lloyd Kramer, and we were talking about this, and she was talking about a group that they have a program at Chapel Hill where incoming faculty, especially if they're not from North Carolina, they take them kind of on a tour of the state, right? So that you can get to know the state that you're living in, especially if you're at one of our public institutions and knowing it. But she talked about how there were people who were a part of that one tour that they did of one of our sites, Somerset Place, which is out in Criswell, North Carolina. But they have foregrounded the story of the enslaved at that site. In a way that she said was very difficult for some of the faculty to actually engage. And she said some people had to just walk away from it, right? But I think I would like to see that change. That would be one major thing I'd like to see change during my time in this role, to see if we can bridge that divide, have a more active and robust conversation between these kind of two groups. And I think that there's a desire for that. I had a conversation with Dr. Jim Laludis about this, and I said, you know, there's this divide. He says, not a divide, it's a chasm. He said, it's huge. So I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one who sees this. So I hope that answers the question.
So I'd like to know how close we are to having a history museum here in Western North Carolina. I'm going to ask the question.
I've got to look at the budget when we get back to see what was there. We were going through it. There's a real, that conversation, John Ager and I've been talking about strategy. The director of our museum system, Ken Howard, and I were on the phone yesterday. We're trying to get the folks over in Eastern North Carolina to stop giving us stuff. And he said, I want to see us get a new museum here. So we are working on it. We're working on it.
With the focus on STEM in high schools and even grammar schools now, and history that most of us went to, though it was whitewashed history often, but is history being taught in high schools, junior highs, and if so, how are you interacting? You mentioned a little bit about this, but could you expand on it?
Yeah, because I was in higher ed, I didn't pay as much attention to what was really happening in high school and middle school. I know that you have to take history is it the 4th or 5th grade, I think, and then it's later in the 8th grade, right? It's interesting. The state legislature, though, it's interesting things that have been happening. The effort to tell stories, more diverse stories, because we were very surprised out of the last budget 2 years ago that they created, I think back in 2009, they created the African American Heritage Commission was created, which has done tremendous work, I think, in actually promoting African American history and culture across the state of North Carolina. And to our surprise, they created in the last budget the American Indian Heritage Commission, which is now taking up that work in our department. So there seems to be an appetite for telling more stories. And I was really surprised because I will say, and you probably know this, getting into the job, this has been another thing that I think that was really surprising. There was a culture in the Office of Archives and History that we just keep our heads down and we don't ask for anything. Well, I'm going to ask, so I'm just raising my hand. We need more funding for the things that we want to do. Maintaining records, making sure that those records are accessible is extremely important for genealogy and a number of other things, the research that we do as historians. But if you look at how the history side of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources has been funded, it's minuscule compared to the other parts of the department. But this Secretary Wilson, has been saying in all of our meetings with OSBM, I'm sitting through all of these meetings, that we need more funding on the history side of the department. It has been neglected. So we were reviewing the House's budget yesterday. This afternoon we were going through a review of it, and surprising, many of the things that we did ask for, we were getting. So it just shows me that if you raise your hand and say we need, that people will generally respond in a positive way to that.
I just have a little follow-up question to that. I've heard generally it said that state government is hurting to hire people, like giant numbers of vacancies all across state government in North Carolina, and you have addressed that cultural resources certainly needs more money, but I wonder what you're seeing in terms of the in terms of archives and history, in terms of hiring new generation of professionals to do that work, because the pay has been terrible.
It has, and it's tough. This is a big issue that we are trying to address as well. I'm with my deputy state historic preservation officer, Ramona Bartos, and I tell everybody, Ramona, I get the benefit of carrying the title as the state historic preservation officer, but she's really the expert, and she's really good. We spent a week in Washington, and just recently, and we walked 7 miles in one day, just in Russell, Longworth, and Cannon, going from congressman's office to congressman's office, arguing for more funding for the Historic Preservation Act, which is beneficial to saving our historic spaces across the country. I think in 1970, if I remember the numbers right, the funding in the Historic Preservation Fund that was created in the 1970s, in 1974, I think, was $173 million that they put into it. It has not risen since then, right? And we were saying, okay, if you adjust for inflation and all of that, we would be coming here asking you for maybe $1 billion or more, but we're only asking you to at least double this, right? But that's money that we have to spread out across the entire country. That's not just coming to North Carolina. So hiring people, and what I've discovered, the conversations that's going on within the academy about what is the future of history and history departments and humanities, I think that there's a lot of opportunity on the public history side that we may be missing. And so I was invited to come down and give a talk to stand in for Congresswoman Elma Adams down in Charlotte. And there was a lady who was there, African-American woman, and her son was getting ready to go to college at UNC Charlotte. And she said he came in and told me and his father that he wanted to major in history. And we said, well, what are you going to do with that degree? And she said, and then you walk in here and you start talking about all of the opportunities. I guess I was wrong about what he could actually do with that degree. So I think we need to promote that more. I am asking people, and Ann, I thank you for opening this door for me to do that. Every conversation that I'm in around the state, when people are asking me, what do you need? I need you to advocate with your representatives, both in the House and the Senate, for more funding on the history side, and especially more pay for the people who are doing the jobs now. I mean, I'm amazed. The State Historic Preservation Office has been down by 50%. For the past couple of years. And so even down 50% in staff, I'm amazed at how much work this team is actually getting done. I saw Anita back there, and I have to say, Anita, we got historic status for Shiloh and for the church. And I'm gonna tell you, and Anita.
You were so great in the meeting.
Did you see?
I can't go back to Asheville.
I did. So you were watching the meeting. I told him, I said, I try not to insert myself into what the committee is going to do, but on this one, I have to tell you, if you do not approve it, I will not be able to go back home. So, and I was very proud to put my signature on that one, Anita. So we got that. I mean, and this is part of the work that we're trying to do even here, and I think that this is a part of the reparative work. They're doing some amazing stuff in Edenton, North Carolina, around where the traditional African-American professional class live, to restore that community. And they have created a fund that makes it possible, because Edenton, like many places, is experiencing gentrification as well. But as you repair these buildings and fix things up, the tax goes up and the burden on the people who live there. They've created a fund in the city that allows people to dip into that fund to be able to cover the costs of this increase in their taxes so that they can stay in those houses. So there's some things that we can do. We're also trying to make sure, because so much of African American history has been lost, right? I mean, the uncovering that Dan and this team have done around this project, even to get the names of people that we know the names, preserving these records, I think that's a part of the reparative work that has to be done. So there's opportunities to do that. So some of the conversations that I've been in around historic districts and how historic districts are developed and who's included and who's not. Traditionally, many African American communities of color are lost in that conversation because so much of what existed that you might count as historical has been razed, is gone. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how do you address those issues? That's some of the reparative work that we need to do. And I think it relates to what you'll be hearing as you continue this conversation. Ellen, I mean, the work that Ellen has been doing here with her team, with the cemetery project here, I think is fundamentally important, and we're trying to do more of that work across the state. And I think that what you've done here serves as a model. I talk about it all the time. If you want to know how to do this, then you need to talk to my colleagues at UNC Asheville. They know how to get this done. So that's some of the reparative work. So, Ann, thank you for opening that door. But yeah, advocate for better pay for these people who are preserving our public history.
Hi, I really love listening to you and getting down the names of people and some authors I've never heard of and books I've never read. But I'm really concerned as an educator and who's worked as an educator throughout the elementary school, middle school, high school, and prison system in New York. We can't allow banning of books. I mean, I know that if I got information that I knew, somewhere in my head, I knew even in first grade, that Native Americans didn't walk around with no clothes on. I mean, you know, it was freezing cold and ice and snow all over the place. Something brought that to my attention. And I got that clarified when I got home, because we had dinner table talks. We were not as silent at dinner. And I'm looking at now what's going on. And if we take all these books out of our libraries and out of our schools, what history will our children have? Because and then if they'd only get this in this grade and that in that grade, we're really condemning a whole generation after generation of no education.
Right. We're doing a disservice. It's a disservice.
Terrible.
So this is a part of, you know, my argument about engagement and engage the complexity. I think that the earlier we can do that, I mean, just be honest and forthright about what the experiences have been, right? I think the more we try to cover it up, eventually it's going to rear its head and you're going to get, you know, a reaction that it's not going to be good. So I'm with you. I think we need to have honest intellectual engagement.
What do you think is a way to get some of these people to understand that banning books is dangerous? It's like burning of books that happened in the South years ago. And I know that a lot of people, oh, I hate this guy, I'm never going to read this. But if we don't read it, we don't know what we hate.
It's a way to refine your argument, right? You can't refine the argument against something if you don't know what they're saying, right? So I think reading broadly becomes.
Some of the responses from our legislature a little disarming, and the whole country's in this. It's not, I'm not talking about just North Carolina. I'm just, how do we fight this? We have so much to fight to bring out an equality, and then we want to do something else. Well, that's great to do something else, but we got to stop some of this banning books, cutting health care. I mean, all of those things affect everybody.
I'll say this in response. My conversation recently with Senator Val Applewhite, who's from Cumberland County, who was deeply concerned about the construction of this new history center there. And we sat down and we had a conversation about it. And I'm surprised sometimes at how we don't, I guess I'm not surprised, that people don't have a lot of historical context, right? Is we just don't engage it. And so when I was talking to her, she wanted to know. She said, I want to know from you. And the mayor of Fayetteville was asking us the same question. What guarantee can you give me that when you're gone, it doesn't go to something else? And the reality is I can't guarantee what some future generation can do. I just can't. But what I did argue, and this seemed to resonate with Senator Applewhite when we left the meeting, she said, I feel much better about this now because, and with the folks who were there from Cumberland County around this project, I said, what is different about this conversation? I said, I'm willing to have this conversation as many times as I need to have it with you, because what's different is that you're at the table, right? You're here. The time, if we want to talk about the lost cause narrative and the construction of the lost cause narrative, which she was concerned about with this new history center, it's like, look, at the time that that narrative was being constructed, African Americans had been disfranchised politically, were not a part of the process. We are a part of the process now. And what I'm hoping will happen, I said, I hope that this is not a flash in the pan moment where you and I are engaged in the conversation. You've got the city council in Fayetteville that is deeply engaged in the conversation. I told her, I have two sons who I've told them as their responsibilities as citizens of this state, as citizens of this country, is to be engaged in the process. You can't just go to work and go home and lay down and go to sleep. You got to know what's going on. You got to participate in the conversations. You've got to be there. So I feel like it's our responsibility as this generation of leaders to be encouraging the next generation to be just as engaged in the conversations as we are today. And we will, you know, one of my favorite books, and Ann Ponder gave me this book years ago to read, well, a couple of years ago, well, no, it's been maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but Adam Gopnik's book, 1,000 Small Sanities is what it's called, about how we have really moved the needle. That is a part of the story. I mean, it's taken some real hard pushing, but we have moved the needle because of those ideals that were enshrined in that Declaration of Independence early on. We have moved, it created the space for us to move the needle. And so I don't want that to get lost in any of the conversations that we might have about these painful pieces of our past. And it's not just African Americans. I mean, I couldn't help but think about, you know, labor. The history of labor in this country is so fraught. I mean, I think about Homestead in Pennsylvania and what was happening in the steel industry with labor and all of that. And these were not black faces or brown faces. These are, you think about the West, I mean, it's, the history of labor, you know, is something for us to engage and to think about. And Jim, I thought about this for you because this has stayed with me ever since I've read your parents' book, Neither White Nor Black. In the very opening pages of that book, and I have the book here with me, now I'm gonna pull it out to read it, but your mom and dad talk about how labor, because of the way we have treated the people who have built things, in the case of the Western North Carolina Railroad and other things, you know, enslavement and all of that, that we've degraded labor. It's been degraded, and there's a need for us to re-engage that in a way where there's some respectability to work and to labor. And your parents bring that up in that book, and that has resonated and stayed with me for a long time. So I think that there's a conversation that needs to be had around that. Are people being paid a fair wage for the work that they do? We need to engage those conversations, and I hope that we will.
Okay, got time for one more question? Someone? Yes? Well, if not, let me make just a few comments. Thank you again, Darren. Couple of things. First, Darren mentioned Jim Stokely back here has some books out here written by his mother, Wilma Dykeman. And if you're new to Western North Carolina, or if you've been here a long time and you never read The French Broad, shame on you. But you have an opportunity to rectify that situation. I think every household in Western North Carolina ought to be required to have that book on the shelf. It's amazing, written in 1955, is that correct? It's one of those books that has, I don't know how many times I've read through that book, but it's one that holds up, and it's just so important. And we really live in the shadow of Wilma Dykeman with the rail project, because she was one of the very first who really, in her chapter, what's the title of that chapter, Jim? Yeah, the Green Trail and the Iron Path in that book is one of the first really explorations of what of the cost, of the human cost of the construction of the railroad in Western North Carolina. So I can't recommend that book enough. And so Jim's got some of his mom's book there, so take advantage of that. Please get some dessert. Take some with you home. Let's don't leave anything behind. Please eat up and grab something on your way out. Stay around. We're not rushing anybody off. Again, we can go back to Old Home Week here as we finish. And thank you so much for coming out.